You want to hear something interesting? This is my first Alienware laptop. In fact, our first Alienware laptop review in 8 years. I'm not kidding, guys. If you actually look it up, we checked out the Alienware 14 gaming laptop that was a thick boy featuring an i7-4700MQ CPU and a GTX 765M graphics card. Times have changed, and if you look at the transformation from that to this, it's genuinely remarkable with what we have achieved in almost a decade. So this is the Alienware x14, the world's thinnest 14-inch gaming laptop. What's really unique about this device is its form factor and the specs that Dell has managed to cram inside this portable beast. Is it the fastest out there? Not really, but I think by the end of the video, you'll get a better picture as to where this stands with the rest of the competition. So let's get right into it. And I want to kick things off with the price because it starts at $1,500. And for that, you get an i5-12500H CPU with 4 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores for a total of 16 threads, 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 memory at 4,800 megahertz, half a terabyte of storage, an RTX 3050 with 4 gigs of VRAM, and a 1080p 144Hz display. The next tier bumps up the cost by $200, and that upgrades the CPU to an i7-12700H with 4 extra threads and an RTX 3050 Ti. Now, if you want more power, there is an RTX 3060 option, which is what I have over here. That costs about $1,900, and it comes with a slightly faster memory configuration. Now, there are flexible storage options that can go all the way up to 4 terabytes, which is gonna cost you around $2,500 US. Now, I know what some of you guys are already gonna ask. How does this compare to something like the Razer Blade 14? Well, from a pricing perspective, it's pretty much the same. Albeit, the Blade can be configured with an RTX 3080 Ti and a Quad HD 165Hz display for an insane amount of money. But thankfully, the X14 has the option to get 32 gigabytes of RAM, something that the Blade lacks. You also get AMD's fastest Ryzen 9 6900HX CPU on the Blade. So if you want us to do a full comparison between the X14 and the Blade 14, let me know in the comments down below. The design of the X14 is truly unique, guys. I'm just gonna go on camera and say that it's freaking amazing. It gives you space vibes and it looks like a concept design that you can actually get your hands on. The entire chassis is made out of CNC milled aluminum, and then it's finished using an anodic electrophoretic deposition. I'm not kidding, that's exactly what Dell has on the reviewer's guide, which sounds pretty cool, but in reality, it's this beautiful soft touch lunar light texture that's really soothing to hold and just manipulate with your hands. A few other things to point out is that you get the Alienware logo that's RGB backlit and a massive 14 text that's laser etched on the lid. Now, I've only had this thing for a few weeks, which I know is a short amount of time to comment on the wear and tear of this particular finish. But so far, it's been holding out pretty well. There were no scratches, no scuff marks from just my usual day-to-day usage. But if I were you, I would pay close attention to just making sure that it's kept clean. Build quality is fantastic. For the price, I think Alienware has nailed my expectations for a slim gaming laptop. Everything feels rigid, including the hinge. It's super smooth with a little bit of wobble. Now, in order to make the X14 super slim at just 0.57 inches or 14.5 millimeters, Alienware designed a custom patented dual torque hinge system that moves forward or backward on a track. This also allowed them to cram all that hardware that I talked about earlier, which is really innovative. With that being said, there is an extension at the back to make room for this hinge design, and that results in a much wider footprint compared to something like the Blade 14 or even the Zephyrus G14 from Asus. So if you're trying to fit this into a compact messenger bag, you might have a bit of a trouble with that, but if you're a backpack type of person, you're not gonna have any issues. It's also pretty lightweight, coming in at around 4 pounds, maybe a little bit less or more depending on the spec you configure with. The power adapter is nice and compact. It is rated for 130 watts and it's super portable. Interestingly, the Z height on this is thicker than the X14, so I hope that gives you a clear picture as to how slim this laptop really is. The adapter also charges via USB Type-C, and there is an LED indicator to showcase the power status. And now we're gonna take a quick look at today's video sponsor.
The all-new HS series from Corsair is what your ears have been waiting for. The HS55 stereo brings a comfortable, super lightweight and awesome sounding headset to your budget gaming station with a fantastic sounding microphone. The HS65 surround steps it up a notch with included USB dongle and Sound ID technology for next level audio, while the HS80 RGB USB is probably my new favorite daily driver because of these awesome breathable ear pads, a fantastic sounding clear microphone, and really powerful high-res drivers. Check out the full HS series down below.
All right, if you look at the interior space of the X14, you'll notice that there's a standard keyboard layout that's positioned right at the center of the chassis. On the right-hand side, there are dedicated volume adjust keys along with a power button. I really wished if it was a fingerprint scanner, just like the XPS13. I mean, Dell could have easily taken that and slapped it onto the X14, but hey, it is a custom individually LED lit button that can be customized through Alienware Command Center. So you can have it set it to blink if you're running low on battery or fade colors when it's charging. So I'll give props to them for adding that visual element. At the top, there are exhaust vents that are see-through both on the left and right-hand side, which is pretty cool. I mean, they had to improvise on the cooling system to make the X14 this thin, and we'll check out how it performs later in the video. My biggest issue with this layout is the placement of the keyboard. Now, I have big hands, and given that this has a very narrow palm rest area, I couldn't comfortably place my palms on them to type properly. The center alignment pushed me away to the edges, and it was really odd. And let me tell you, it's just not fun, especially if you use it for longer periods of time. If you have baby hands, it shouldn't be a problem, but I thought it was worth bringing up. As for the switches, they are okay. It's not the best or the worst that I've come across. Given the slim profile nature, it surprisingly manages to give you a tactile response, even though there is only about 1.2 millimeters of key travel distance. It does feature RGB lighting. Unfortunately, it's not per key customizable, so take that into account. The trackpad is very smooth. It uses precision glass and it's excellent to navigate with. The integrated left and right buttons exhibit tactile feedback. It's honestly a little too small for my taste. I actually prefer the Blade 14 or even the Zephyrus G14 since they have much larger trackpads compared to the X14, and it also offers a smooth and precise navigation. The ports situation is actually really interesting on this laptop. Now, all of them are located at the back, which will certainly help with cable management. So you get a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C port with DisplayPort pass-through and power delivery, an audio jack, HDMI 2.1, a full-size Gen 1 Type-A port, a micro UHS 2 card reader, and 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. Now, for those of you wondering, you can use either one of these USB-C ports to charge the laptop, but I did wish if the headphone jack was relocated on the side or even just giving us a single USB-C port for just a quick plug-and-play setup to transfer files from a USB drive or an external hard drive. It would have been super convenient. Now, speaking of USB drives, you're gonna have trouble plugging in Type-C drives at the back because of how short the connector is. It makes contact with the ledge. Now, you could force your way in, but I don't think that's a good idea for the actual port that's inside the laptop. The built-in DAC is phenomenal. There's plenty of power to drive high-end headphones. By default, I think it's a little too bass heavy, but you can actually tweak that profile through the Dolby Access app that's pre-installed on this laptop. This is the webcam test on the X14. The quality is all right. It is using a 720p sensor, but I would have preferred it to have a 1080p sensor, especially for this price point. Also, microphone sounds okay. It sounds a little bit compressed, but I have heard better quality microphones on laptops that cost a lot less than the X14, but this should get the job done for just casual meetings and things like that. The speakers are surprisingly really powerful on the X14. They are front-facing, which results in clear trebles. So if you listen to music that's emphasized on vocals, there is good fidelity. The bass response, on the other hand, is very minimal. Now, for FPS shooting, I think this will be great, but if you're looking for entertainment purposes and things like that, I would suggest using a good pair of headphones. Shifting gears to the display, and what we have over here is a 14-inch 1080p 144Hz panel with a 3 millisecond response time and NVIDIA G-Sync. Now, the colors are fantastic with good vibrancy and contrast as it covers 100% sRGB, 87% Adobe RGB, and 99% P3. So this is a comfortable fit for your content creation needs and most definitely gaming. On top of that, it's matte and it gets really bright. Our sample was able to sustain a peak brightness level of around 426 nits, so you shouldn't have any issues with outdoor visibility. I just wished if it came with a 16:10 screen because the ROG G14 has one. Also, 165 Hz would have been nice. It's just that for a laptop that has such a wider footprint, the display, it looks too small. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I would love to know your thoughts about this in the comments down below. Upgradability is very limited on the X14. Remember, in order to maintain this form factor, they had to downsize and integrate the memory onto the PCB, so you only get one shot at configuring it. The only user upgradable component is the NVMe SSD, which is right over here, and the drive speeds are wicked fast. We got over 6.8 gigabytes per second on read and around 5.2 gigabytes per second on write. Now, before I move on to battery testing, I've got to say, everyone here had high expectations for the X14 since Alienware managed to cram a pretty big 80 watt-hour battery into this small 14-inch frame. That's actually a bit bigger than the 2022 version of the Zephyrus G14. But like a lot of laptops I've looked at before, this one suffers from the Alder Lake problem of pretty disappointing battery life when just doing regular tasks, like web browsing for instance. This seems to be a problem that affects almost every single system based on Intel's newest architecture, and we know why. It's because Windows 11 and Alder Lake don't play nice together. Basically because of miscommunication between Intel's thread director and Windows, the CPU just won't go into the lowest power state. The fact that this is still happening so long after launch, it's just so ridiculous, guys. Except that didn't happen with the XPS 15 because of the way how they handled their firmware. And if they can figure it out, it's just weird that Alienware, that has Dell as a parent company, can't. Maybe it's just a matter of time. Now, if you push the X14 under a full load on battery, there's nothing to be concerned about either, even though this laptop posts the absolute worst score of all of these. Why? Well, because Alienware is running the 12700H at higher wattages, even when it's on battery. And speaking of how Alienware runs this version of the X14, we need to dive a little bit into their control center, just because there's just a lot going on that you need to know about. So there's tons of space dedicated to creating profiles for games in your library, but at the bottom, there's actually quick access for overclocking, thermals, and power. Now, these are detailed a bit more in the Fusion section, so let's dive into that. First of all, in the overclocking section, you can actually adjust the power and thermal limits along with frequencies for the CPU and the GPU. But look, after trying this out, none of these controls really do anything, at least not on the X14. And that's because Alienware's already running this thing right at the bleeding edge, and there's just nothing left in the tank. The power section might sound like it would manage performance profiles, but it actually doesn't. All you have here is a repeat of what Windows offers you, along with a toggle of Alien effects, but the thermal profiles is where all the fun happens. Now here, you can actually select any of the 5 presets or create your own. They actually can control both the fan speeds and power limits, and most of them are pretty self-explanatory, running from quiet all the way up to full speed. Now, I know this might look confusing at first, but basically, Alienware's 5 modes can be popped into 2 very similar groups. First, there's battery and quiet, which are pretty much the same setting. Then there's balanced, full speed, and performance that run almost identically at between 110 watts and 90 watts for the first minute or so. Balance then falls back a bit to a constant 55 watts, while full speed and performance end up being basically the same with full speed, finally settling to a small 2 watt advantage. Now with frequencies, you can actually see even with minor increases in power delivery, it can result in some differences. But there's still barely 300 megahertz separating balanced, performance, and full speed. The same thing goes for quiet and battery saver. Temperatures aren't really a problem, but you can see what I meant about Alienware running hardware right up to the bleeding edge. At least for the first 60 seconds of any test, the X14 runs at a constant 100 degrees. Then by modulating power, temperatures end up a lot more manageable levels. The only problem with this kind of behavior is that it artificially inflates results of shorter synthetic benchmarks, which is why we end up using more real-world testing. When it comes to the way how the GPU behaves, it's important to remember that the RTX 3060 can run at up to 75 watts, which includes 15 watts of dynamic boost headroom, but that only happens when there's enough TDP overhead, and from what we can tell, it never hits that level. Instead, Full speed caps out at around 72 watts, while balanced in performance run it at 68 watts. Quiet isn't too bad either, with a constant 50 watt input. And guys, just please don't ever use battery saver to game on the X14 since it's all over the place. Now with this kind of power, this certainly isn't the fastest RTX 3060 we've seen, but its clock speeds are pretty decent in 3 modes that most of you will use it in. So there's really nothing to worry about here, but again, you need to be aware that battery saver will cause major frame rate stuttering since its clock speeds are super inconsistent. Meanwhile, this GPU's temperatures never go above 70 degrees for any length of time, which is actually amazing to see when you take into account how slim the X14 really is. But all of that means nothing if things get screaming loud in every single mode, right? Now, there are 2 things that jump out right away. First of all, full speed is way too loud to use on a regular basis, especially for a relatively small frequency increase that it gives you. Personally, I think balanced is the way to go here since it pretty much gives you the same speeds as performance mode. And it's pretty much, actually it's a lot more quieter than that mode. The other weird thing is that battery saver gets you worse clock speeds than quiet mode, but the fans spin a lot faster. If you look at surface temperatures, most of the heat buildup is around the top center section of the laptop that's away from your keyboard, so that's nice, and it's exhausted at the back and the sides, so surface temperatures don't get to worrying levels. All right, so now that we know how the X14 behaves, we're gonna be testing it in balance mode against a bunch of other laptops. But there's something that I need to mention here again because folks keep asking about it. So these are the laptops that'll be in our charts, and in them you'll see that the CPU and GPU wattage each result is based on. Now you'll probably notice a lot of these are lower than what manufacturers claim, and that's because spec sheets often just use a theoretical maximum instead of what's realistically gonna happen. Now those extreme power numbers only get reached for shorter periods of time when the laptop gets screaming loud. Anyways, what you see here is the average wattage for each laptop over a 10-minute CPU or GPU load in the highest performance mode that remained under 46 decibels. So it's just something that you can use that doesn't actually blow your eardrums out, or it's just way too much fan noise. Now in this case with the Alienware X14, we're using this thing in balance mode, while something like the G14 from ROG uses performance mode. With that being said, let's actually take a look at how the world's thinnest 14-inch gaming laptop performs. Now, as we go through this, it is important to remember that this is a small, very thin gaming laptop that's keeping up with some of the fastest 15-inch or 16-inch models we've tested. I mean, it isn't cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a premium, portable device that runs its CPU at much higher speeds than some bigger machines out there. Not only that, but it actually manages to keep the 12700H cool longer through loads, so performance is very consistent. And when you add the faster 5200 MHz memory kit to the equation, it can actually give laptops with higher end GPUs a run for their money in NLEs like Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve. Now I've got to say, that's really impressive, but it'll also be interesting to see what happens when we add other 14-inch devices like the new Blade 14 in the near future. But what about gaming? Well, let's check that out too. So this is one area where the X14 struggles a bit to justify its price against some cheaper options. But you need to put this into context as well, guys. The X14 is built indefinitely better than something like the Acer Nitro 5, and it's more portable than the Legion 5i Pro. The gaming numbers are pretty respectable too, without any games struggling to hit playable frame rates. Actually, from a size and price to performance ratio, the only real competition here in our charts is the Zephyrus G14, which you can find for just under $2,000 these days at Best Buy. And both laptops have their strengths and weaknesses. So here's the deal with the Alienware X14. I really like this laptop. I think the Z height alone is probably its most interesting feature, and the performance that it puts out is pretty respectable, guys, especially when you compare it to thicker and more power-hungry laptops in the market. Battery life is decent, but you gotta realize that it's an Intel 12th Gen problem, and of course Windows 11 as well. But I think the design of this thing, it just makes a statement. And pricing is not too bad when you compare to 14-inch alternatives. You also get better customer support with these guys, which is great. My only concern with this is the keyboard placement, the lack of a 16:10 screen, and a better webcam. But past that, this is a pretty amazing laptop, and I would actually consider this over the Blade 14. But I'll confirm with you guys on that when I get the 2022 version here in the studio, so stay tuned for that. On that note, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you were able to take away everything that you needed to know about the Alienware X14. Let me know what you guys think about in the comments. The X15 video is coming up very soon, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, spend responsibly.